NYC's most notorious gangsters, a full list of drug lords. For most of a century, a handful of New York neighborhoods produced more drug kingpins than anywhere in America. Almost every one of them ended the same way: dead, buried in a federal cell, or vanished without a trace. This is a countdown of the 10 most notorious drug lords New York ever produced. And number 1 is the man all the others were trying to become. Subscribe before we begin. It is free, and it rewards the work we put into these. Frank Matthews. He may be the biggest drug lord you have never heard of. At his peak, he was moving product in more than 20 states, richer than almost anyone in the business, black or white. And then, in the summer of 1973, out on bail and facing the rest of his life in prison, Frank Matthews walked out the door with a fortune in cash and was never seen again. Not captured, not killed, simply gone. Matthews came up from nothing. Born in Durham, North Carolina in the mid-1940s, he drifted north as a young man and landed in New York with no connections and no money. He started small, in the numbers rackets, and he had a temper that got him bounced from the operation. The story goes that he beat a policy boss badly enough to end his future in that world, and the closed door pushed him toward a far more dangerous business. But he was watching, and he understood something most hustlers around him did not. The real money was not in the numbers. It was in heroin, and later, in cocaine, and the men who controlled the supply controlled everything. For years, that supply ran through the Italian mafia. If you were a black dealer in Harlem, you bought from them, at their price, on their terms. Matthews decided he was done with that arrangement. He built his own connections, reaching past the mafia to sources feeding him heroin and cocaine directly, and he began to sell across the country. He set up cutting and packaging houses, where workers processed and bagged product by the kilo, then pushed it out through a web of distributors reaching into more than 20 states. Federal agents would later describe him as one of the most significant traffickers they had ever tracked, a man supplying dealers in dozens of cities at once. This was the thing that made him different. He did not just run a corner or a neighborhood. He built a genuine nationwide distribution network at a time when almost no black trafficker had ever done it. In 1971, he did something that made him a legend in that world. He is said to have organized a gathering of black and Latino traffickers from across the country, in Atlanta, with a single message: stop depending on the Italians. Pool your buying power, cut your own deals, and keep the profit in your own hands. Whether or not every detail of that meeting is exactly as the stories tell it, the ambition behind it was real, and it terrified the established order. For a black dealer to organize on that scale, independent of the families who had always controlled the supply, was not just business, it was a declaration of independence, and it made Matthews a marked man in more ways than one. The money that came in was staggering. Matthews lived enormous. He gambled fortunes in Las Vegas and Atlantic City, losing sums in a weekend that most men would never see in a lifetime. He kept a luxury apartment in Brooklyn, along with cars and jewelry, the whole picture of a man who had beaten the game. He surrounded himself with trusted people, moved cash by the suitcase, and ran an operation large enough that counting the money became a full-time job of its own. By the early 1970s, federal agents believed he was one of the most important drug traffickers in the entire country. That was exactly the problem. A man that big does not stay invisible. In early 1973, Matthews was arrested on federal drug and tax charges. Investigators had tracked him for months, and when they finally took him down, they believed they had caged the most important black drug trafficker in America. And then the system made a mistake it would regret for decades. He was released on bail, somewhere in the neighborhood of $325,000. On the 2nd of July 1973, Frank Matthews walked out and disappeared, and by most accounts, he took millions in cash with him. He did not run alone. He is believed to have slipped away with a companion and a fortune large enough to buy silence, new names, and distance, and he spent every dollar of it disappearing. He was never found. The FBI hunted him for years. They chased sightings, tips, rumors, and came up with nothing. He had connections, money, and a talent for staying one step ahead, and he used all three to erase himself completely. To this day, no one can say with certainty whether he lived out a long, quiet life under another name or died somewhere anonymous long ago. And here is the thing that puts him on this list, even though he never spent his life behind bars. Frank Matthews is the rare kingpin who beat the ending everyone else on this countdown met. He did not get gunned down. He did not die in a cell. He looked at the throne, understood that keeping it would cost him everything, and simply walked away from it while he still could. The empire did not destroy him. He dissolved it, and himself, before it had the chance. But that kind of escape is almost unheard of. Everyone else who reached for a crown like his paid the full price for it. The next man rose higher inside a single Harlem syndicate than almost anyone, high enough that his name got attached to one of the most famous buildings in the city, and it bought him a sentence that will never end. Number 9. Guy Fisher. He was a young man who climbed so high inside the biggest heroin syndicate Harlem ever produced that his name got tied to the Apollo Theatre itself. He had money, respect, and a seat at the very top of the operation, and more than 40 years later, Guy Fisher is still sitting in a federal prison, serving a sentence with no release date and no way out. Fisher came up in Harlem in the 1960s and rose through the ranks of an organization run by a man you will meet much higher on this list, a dealer who called himself Mr. Untouchable. That organization was known as the Council, a small board of men who ran Harlem's drug trade like a corporation, dividing territory, setting prices, and settling disputes among themselves. Getting a seat at that table meant you were one of the most feared drug figures in the city. Fisher earned one, and he was young when he did it. He had been born in the South Bronx in the late 1940s, and he came up fast, moving into the leadership of a Harlem operation that controlled a huge share of the narcotics flowing through the neighborhood. By his early 30s, he was not a foot soldier, he was one of the bosses. At his height, Fisher was pulling in extraordinary money, and unlike a lot of dealers, he tried to turn that money into something that looked legitimate and lasting. In the late 1970s, his name became attached to the Apollo Theatre, the legendary Harlem stage that had launched generations of black performers. By many accounts, he took over the operation of the building and reopened its doors, and the story that a Harlem drug lord had come to control the Apollo became part of his legend. It is worth being careful here, because the legend runs ahead of the record. The claim that Fisher outright owned the Apollo, or that he was the first black man to do so, is disputed and probably overstated. What is clear is that his money and his name were bound up with the theatre during that era, and that for a young man who had come up in the Harlem drug trade, planting his flag on an institution like the Apollo was the ultimate statement. It announced that he had outgrown the corner and meant to be remembered. For a few years, the theatre ran under his influence, hosting shows and drawing crowds back to a stage that had fallen on hard times. Whatever the exact paperwork said, the image was unforgettable. A man who moved heroin for a living, standing in the lobby of the most famous black theatre in America, as if he owned the place. That visibility cut both ways. The same council that made Fisher rich was drawing the full attention of federal prosecutors who had made it their mission to dismantle Harlem's drug hierarchy from the top down. And the man at the very top, the one who had brought Fisher up, eventually did something that shattered the entire structure. He began cooperating with the government. When the boss of an organization decides to talk, everyone beneath him becomes a target, with a roadmap drawn straight to their door. That betrayal from the top ended a dozen careers at once. When Mr. Untouchable started naming the men he had built his empire with, the council stopped being a brotherhood and became a witness list. Fisher was convicted in the early 1980s under the Federal Continuing Criminal Enterprise Statute, the law written specifically to bury the leaders of large drug organizations. It carries the kind of punishment usually reserved for the worst crimes imaginable: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a man who had spent his youth building an empire and buying his way into Harlem legend, the door closed and it did not reopen. What makes Fisher's story different from many on this list is what he did after it. Inside prison, he did not fade. He went back to school behind the walls, earning college degrees, eventually reaching the highest levels of academic work a person can pursue, all from a cell. It is a strange and human footnote to a brutal story. A man who spent decades proving he could have built something legitimate in the one place where it could no longer do him any good. He is said to have become one of the very few people ever to earn a doctorate entirely from behind prison walls, a scholar in a cell, deep into a sentence with no end. But none of it changes the arithmetic of his life. Fisher reached for the top of the Harlem drug world and got there. He put his name on the Apollo. He sat on the council, and every bit of that height is exactly why the government wanted him so badly, and exactly why he has spent the back half of his life in a federal penitentiary with no date circled on any calendar. The crown he chased is the reason the cell door never opens. Fisher rose inside someone else's syndicate and fell when it collapsed on top of him. The next man refused to answer to anyone. He built his own kingdom in the streets of Queens, and when the law finally caged him, he did something almost no one thought was possible. He kept running the whole operation from inside. If you are into this kind of deep dive, do me a favor and subscribe. It is free, and it is what lets us keep digging these stories up. Number 8. Lorenzo Nichols. They called him Fat Cat, and for a stretch of the 1980s he owned South Jamaica, Queens, as completely as any drug lord has ever owned a piece of New York. But the detail that made his legend is almost hard to believe. When the police finally locked Lorenzo Nichols up, it barely slowed him down. He kept running his empire from inside the prison, giving orders through a steady stream of visitors, allegedly including orders to kill. Nichols built his organization in South Jamaica in the early 1980s, at the exact moment crack was beginning to tear through New York. He was smart, organized, and ruthless, and he turned a stretch of Queens into a drug marketplace that ran with the discipline of a business. He employed dozens of people, lookouts, runners, enforcers, managers, each with a role, all feeding a machine that moved heroin and crack and generated enormous amounts of cash. At its peak, the Nichols operation was one of the most formidable drug organizations the borough had ever seen. Born at the end of the 1950s, Nichols came up in South Jamaica and built his operation around a stretch of the neighborhood he controlled block by block. It was said to pull in tens of thousands of dollars a day, a river of cash running through a small patch of Queens. What set Fat Cat apart was not just the size of the operation, but his grip on it. Even after he landed in prison on a lesser charge, he did not hand the business to anyone. He ran it himself, remotely, through relatives and lieutenants who came to see him and carried his instructions back out to the street. For a while, one of the biggest drug operations in Queens was effectively being managed out of a prison visiting room. It was a stunning demonstration of control, and it was also the arrogance that would help destroy him. He could do it because the operation was built entirely around him. Nothing of importance happened without his say, which kept him firmly in control, and which also meant that every major decision, every shipment, every act of violence could eventually be traced back to one man. Because an organization that violent, run that openly, generates a body count, and a body count generates attention. The Nichols crew was tied to a string of killings across South Jamaica, witnesses, rivals, and people who simply got in the way, and within Fat Cat's orbit was a group of enforcers whose loyalty to him would soon produce the single most infamous act of violence of the entire New York crack era, an act so shocking it would change the way the country fought the drug war. We will get to the man who gave that order in a moment. By the middle of the decade, investigators had made the Nichols organization a top priority, building a dedicated task force to map the crew, turn its members, and document the killings that kept it in power. For Fat Cat himself, the walls closed in at the end of the 1980s. Federal and state prosecutors, working with investigators who had spent years mapping his organization, built a sweeping case against him. In 1989, Nichols pleaded guilty to charges connected to running the enterprise and to his role in murder. He was sentenced to a long prison term, decades that removed him from the streets he had once controlled. Dozens of people connected to the organization were swept up alongside him, and the enterprise that had taken years to build came apart in a matter of months once the government had its cooperators. The empire he had built did not survive him. The same visibility that made Fat Cat a South Jamaica legend, the flash, the reach, the sheer scale of the killing around him, is what turned him into a top target for every level of law enforcement. He had made himself impossible to ignore, and in the drug world, being impossible to ignore is the beginning of the end. Fat Cat had wanted to be seen as untouchable in his own borough, the man who could run Queens from a cell and dare anyone to stop him. That image was his currency, and in the end, it was also the case against him. There is a lesson buried in the way he ran things from his cell. Fat Cat could not let go. He had built something enormous, and rather than disappear into the background and protect himself, he kept his hands on every lever, kept giving orders, kept the machine running with his fingerprints all over it. That refusal to loosen his grip gave prosecutors exactly what they needed: a living, breathing enterprise with one man clearly at the center of it. He did not just get caught holding drugs, he got caught being the boss, over and over, on the record. By the time it was finished, the man who once ran Queens had traded a kingdom for a number and a cell. And the most notorious thing his organization ever did was not a drug shipment at all. It was a murder, ordered by one of his most loyal enforcers, that would put a police officer's face on the national news and reshape the war on drugs. That enforcer is next. Number 7. Howard Mason. In the early morning hours of a February day in 1988, a 22-year-old rookie police officer sat alone in his patrol car on a quiet street in South Jamaica, Queens. His job that night was simple and grim. He was guarding the home of a man who had dared to report drug dealers to the police. The order to kill that officer did not come from anyone on that street. It came from a man already sitting in a jail cell, and when it was carried out, it changed the war on drugs overnight. Howard Mason, known on the street as Pappy, was one of the most feared enforcers in Lorenzo Nichols's South Jamaica organization. He led a crew of his own, fiercely loyal, deeply violent, and utterly devoted to Fat Cat. Mason's currency was fear, and he spent it freely. In a world full of dangerous men, he was the one other dangerous men stepped around. He had come up under Fat Cat and risen to lead his own faction, a crew known for answering the smallest slight with overwhelming violence. Loyalty to the boss was the whole of his code, and he treated any threat to the organization as a threat to himself. By early 1988, both Mason and Nichols were behind bars, and Mason was seething. Police had been leaning hard on the organization, and by some accounts, Mason took a specific act of disrespect toward Fat Cat as a personal insult that demanded an answer. From inside jail, he decided to send the police a message they could not possibly miss. Not a rival dealer, not a witness, a uniformed officer, killed for the crime of wearing the badge. The insult that set him off, by the accounts that emerged later, was a police raid and a gesture of disrespect aimed at Fat Cat. Mason's answer was not to strike at the officers involved. It was to kill any officer at all, to prove that no badge was safe from the organization. The target was chosen almost at random. Officer Edward Byrne was guarding the home of a Guyanese immigrant who had repeatedly called the police on the dealers destroying his neighborhood, and who was under protection because of it. In the pre-dawn dark, 4 men from Mason's crew approached Byrne's patrol car from 2 sides. One distracted him, another opened fire through the window. Byrne, 22 years old and barely out of the academy, was killed where he sat, doing nothing more than guarding a witness's house. The man he was protecting was an immigrant who had watched dealers take over his block and refused to stay silent, calling the police again and again, even after his home was attacked. Byrne, barely a year on the job, had drawn the overnight shift outside that house. The gunman had been sent to kill whoever was sitting in that car. The reaction was like nothing the drug war had produced before. The murder of Edward Byrne became national news. It came to symbolize a country that had let its cities slip into chaos, where dealers felt bold enough to assassinate a police officer as a warning. During the presidential campaign that year, Byrne's badge was carried onto the national stage as a symbol of the fight against drugs. His killing helped drive a wave of tougher drug laws and a surge of money and manpower into the war on the streets. One murder, ordered out of spite from a jail cell, reshaped federal drug policy. In the years that followed, Byrne's name was attached to a national grant program that funneled hundreds of millions of dollars into local policing. A single rookie officer, killed on an ordinary night, became one of the most consequential victims in the history of the American drug war. It also guaranteed that everyone connected to it would be hunted without mercy. The 4 gunmen, Todd Scott, Scott Cobb, David McClary, and Philip Copeland, were caught, tried, and convicted of the murder, each sentenced to at least 25 years to life. And the man who gave the order, Pappy Mason, was pulled into a sweeping federal racketeering case against the Nichols organization. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The message he thought he was sending came back and buried him and everyone who touched the trigger. Think about the logic of what Mason did, because it is the purest example of self-destruction on this entire list. He was already in jail. The smart move, the survivor's move, was to keep his head down and fight his existing case. Instead, out of pride, he ordered the one killing guaranteed to bring the full weight of the American government down on his organization. He did not kill a rival who might fade from memory. He killed a police officer, and in doing so, he turned his crew into the most wanted men in the country and handed prosecutors the moral fuel to pursue every last one of them to the end of the earth. Burns' murder did not protect the organization, it destroyed it, and it stands as the moment the New York crack era stopped being a local crime story and became a national reckoning. The heat it brought fell on everyone in that world, including the next crew on this list, a Queens operation so organized and so deeply woven into the culture that its name still echoes through music decades later. And it too was undone by the very fame it chased. Quick break. If these names are new to you, hit subscribe so the next one finds you. It costs nothing, and it helps more than you would think. Number 6. Kenneth McGriff. They named themselves the Supreme Team, and for a stretch of the 1980s, they ran a corner of Queens with the structure and discipline of a real corporation. Hundreds of members, a clear chain of command, and a founder whose street name became a kind of legend. Kenneth McGriff went to prison, served his time, and came home to a world that still knew his name. And instead of disappearing, he tried to turn that name into a business. That decision is what finally buried him. McGriff, known as Supreme, founded the Supreme Team in the early 1980s in the Baisley Park houses in South Jamaica, Queens, alongside his second-in-command, Gerald Miller, who went by Prince. Together they built one of the most organised crack operations in the city. This was not a loose crew of corner boys. It had ranks, rules, territory, and a hierarchy that functioned like a company, with McGriff at the top and Prince running day-to-day operations. At its height, it was pulling in vast sums from the crack trade and employing a small army of young men from the neighbourhood. Born in 1960, McGriff built the Supreme Team into something that ran less like a gang and more like a firm, with lieutenants, security, and a discipline that let it dominate the Baisley Park houses through the worst years of the crack epidemic. It counted its members in the hundreds and its revenue in the millions. The Supreme Team became more than a drug crew. It became a piece of Queens folklore. Its name, its reputation, and its style seeped into the culture of the borough and eventually into its music. Years later, rappers who grew up in the shadow of that era would reference the Supreme Team in their lyrics, cementing the crew's place in New York legend long after its peak had passed. Few drug organizations ever cast that kind of cultural shadow. That shadow would matter later, because it kept McGriff's name alive and valuable long after the drugs were gone. In the street and in the studios, being connected to the Supreme Team meant something, and McGriff understood exactly how much. But the operation ran on violence, and violence draws prosecutors. In the late 1980s, federal investigators took the organization apart. McGriff was convicted on drug charges and sent to prison. He had run the operation for the better part of a decade before the government finally brought it down, and even then the case only reached the top because so many members below them agreed to talk. Prince Miller, tied directly to the murders and mayhem that came with running the enterprise, was convicted and sentenced to life, ending his role entirely. For a moment, it looked like the story of the Supreme Team was over. It was not, because McGriff came home. Released in the mid-1990s, he stepped back into a New York that had turned his crew into a myth. The Supreme Team was gone, but its name had only grown in the years he was away. And here is where his story turns on the same blade that cut down so many others on this list. Rather than vanish into a quiet life, McGriff wanted to trade on his legend. He attached himself to a rising rap record label, a company that would become one of the most successful in hip-hop, and he used the connection to build a new public identity as a music man and film producer. He helped finance a straight-to-video film, moved through the industry as a man with a legendary past and a legitimate future, and let the old reputation open the new doors. Federal investigators saw something else entirely. They came to believe the label was being used to wash drug money, and that McGriff, far from going straight, was still deep in violence. A long investigation followed, and when it was finished, the government charged him with running a continuing criminal enterprise and with ordering murders, including the killing of a rival who had crossed him. One of those killings was that of a rapper known as E. Moneybags, who had publicly feuded with McGriff and was shot and killed in Queens in 2001. Prosecutors argued McGriff had ordered it over respect and reputation, the same currency the Supreme Team had always run on. In 2007, Kenneth McGriff was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The executives at the record label he had aligned himself with were prosecuted separately on money laundering charges and acquitted, and the label survived. McGriff did not. The very thing he reached for in his second act, the fame, the legend, the desire to be seen and celebrated as the man who was once supreme, is exactly what put him back under the microscope and back in a cell for the rest of his life. He could have stayed a memory. He insisted on being a name, and the name is what the government followed. That is the paradox that runs through this entire countdown. Notoriety is the reward these men chased, and notoriety is the thing that destroys them. The Supreme Team turned the drug game into a brand. The next three names turned it into a Hollywood movie. Three friends from Harlem who rose together, got rich together, and were pulled apart by betrayal, ransom, and murder. Number 5. Azzy Faison, Rich Porter, and Alpo Martinez. Three friends turned Harlem cocaine into millions and into a Hollywood legend. One of them survived being shot nearly to death and walked away to spend the rest of his life preaching against the very world that made him. One was murdered at 25, while his kidnapped younger brother was being held for ransom. And the third betrayed them both, confessed to a long list of killings, walked out of prison a free man, and still did not escape the streets when they finally came for him. In the middle of the 1980s, Azzy Faison, Rich Porter, and Alpo Martinez were among the youngest and flashiest cocaine dealers in Harlem. They were not the biggest operation in the city, but they were the most watched, the most stylish, and the most talked about. And their story would eventually be told on screen in the film Paid in Full. They were teenagers and young men with more money than they knew how to spend, and for a while it looked like they were untouchable. Their names became Harlem folklore while they were still in their 20s, talked about on every block, and decades later, a generation that never met them would know their story from the screen. Azzy Faison was the connect, the one with the supply. He came up fast and moved serious weight, and he lived the life that came with it. Then, in 1987, it all changed in a single night. Faison was inside a Harlem apartment when a robbery exploded into violence. He was shot 9 times and left for dead, and several people around him were killed. Somehow, against every odd, he survived. And when he came out the other side of that, he was done. Faison walked away from the drug trade for good and turned himself into one of the most respected anti-drug voices to ever come out of Harlem, telling young people the truth about where the life actually leads. He is the rare figure on this entire list who got out alive and used the rest of his years to warn others away from the road he had taken. Rich Porter was the star. He was Harlem's most beloved young hustler, famous for his cars, his clothes, his generosity, and a kind of charisma that made him a neighborhood legend while he was still barely an adult. But his story turned into a nightmare. His younger brother, still a boy, was kidnapped and held for ransom. Porter scrambled to meet the kidnappers' demands, but the child did not survive. And in January of 1990, Rich Porter himself was murdered at just 25 years old, his body left in the street. He was buried in Harlem before a crowd that mourned him like a fallen prince. The most magnetic young man in Harlem was gone, and suspicion quickly fell on someone very close to him. That someone was Alpo Martinez. Alpo was the wildest of the three, a young man from Harlem whose ambition and violence had no ceiling. He expanded his operation down to Washington, and as he grew more dangerous. In the nation's capital, he built a second base, moving weight in a city hungry for it, and the further he got from home, the fewer limits he seemed to recognize. By the accounts that came out later, Alpo was behind the murder of Rich Porter, his own friend and partner, a killing tied up in money, ego, and the paranoia that comes with that life. It was the ultimate betrayal, one member of the famous trio murdering another. When the law finally caught Alpo, he did the one thing the streets never forgive. He talked. He became a federal cooperating witness and confessed to a staggering number of killings, more than a dozen by his own admission, trading testimony for a lighter fate. He went into witness protection and lived for years under a new identity, far from the city that made him. And then, remarkably, he was released, and he came back to Harlem under his own name, walking the same streets where everyone knew exactly what he had done. That decision cost him. On Halloween of 2021, decades after the murders that made him infamous, Alpo Martinez was shot and killed on a Harlem street. The man who had betrayed his friends, cooperated against the underworld, and somehow walked free, came home to the one place that would never let it go, and the past finally collected what it was owed. Look at what the game did to these three. One survived a hail of bullets and got out. One was murdered as a young man while his little brother was being held for ransom. And one killed his own friend, informed on everyone he knew, and was killed in the end anyway. The fame they chased made their story immortal, and it also made sure that two of the three would not live to see middle age. Harlem turned them into legends, then made them a warning. Their story is the street version of the American dream curdling into ash. But long before any of these young men picked up a package, the people who taught New York how to move narcotics at scale did not dress like street hustlers at all. They wore suits. They ran the city from the shadows, and one of them sat at the head of the entire American mafia. Still with us? Subscribing is the easiest way to keep this channel making full breakdowns like this one. It is free, and it means a lot. Number 4. Vito Genovese. He clawed his way to the very top of the American mafia, outmaneuvering and outliving the men who stood in his path, until he could call himself the boss of an entire criminal empire. And then a heroin conviction did what 100 rivals with guns never managed to do. It put the boss of bosses in a prison cell and kept him there until the day he died. Vito Genovese belongs on a list of New York drug lords for a reason that is easy to miss. The street dealers on this countdown, the men who sold heroin by the bag on Harlem corners, were the retail end of a business whose wholesale engine was the Italian mafia. For decades, the families controlled the importation and distribution of narcotics into the United States, and the men in the streets bought from them. Genovese was, for a time, the single most powerful figure in that world. To understand him is to understand where the drugs on those Harlem corners actually came from. It did not appear out of nowhere. It moved through a chain that began overseas and ran through the Italian families before it ever reached a street dealer. And for a period, the man at the top of that chain in New York was Vito Genovese. He had come up in the earliest days of organized crime in New York, a protege within the operation that Charles Luciano built. Genovese was ruthless even by the standards of that world. In the 1930s, facing a murder charge, he fled to Italy and waited out the danger, only returning to the United States after the Second World War, when a key witness against him conveniently died and the case collapsed. He had spent the war years in Italy, and he came home to an American underworld that had reorganized in his absence. He intended to rule it. What followed was a masterclass in patience and treachery. Genovese maneuvered against the men above him, and in the late 1950s he made his move. A rival boss, Frank Costello, survived an attempt on his life and chose to step aside rather than keep fighting. Another major figure, Albert Anastasia, was killed in a barbershop. When the dust settled, Vito Genovese stood at the head of one of the 5 families, the family that still carries his name to this day. He tried to cement his status by summoning crime bosses from across the country to a grand meeting, a gathering meant to crown him. Instead, it was raided, exposing the mafia to the public in a way it never had been before, and it made Genovese a marked man in the eyes of the law. For the first time, ordinary Americans could see that a national criminal organization truly existed, with bosses and territories and rules, and the government could no longer pretend otherwise. And then came the fall, and it came through narcotics. In the late 1950s, Genovese was charged in a federal heroin conspiracy, accused of sitting at the top of a major trafficking operation. In 1959, he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. For the most feared gangster in America, it was a stunning collapse. The wholesale king of the underworld, a man who had ordered killings and toppled rivals, was brought down not by a bullet or a rival family, but by the same narcotics business that had made the mafia its fortune. There is a legend attached to this conviction, and it is worth telling carefully. Many people in that world believed Genovese was set up, framed by his own rivals, the men he had crossed on his way to the top, who supposedly arranged for an informant to hang a drug case around his neck and remove him from the board for good. Whether that story is true or exaggerated, the effect was the same. The narcotics charge did what no rival hit had managed. It ended him. There is a bitter symmetry in that. The mafia had spent decades quietly profiting off that drug while keeping its hands clean in public. When the reckoning finally came for the boss at the very top, it came wearing the face of the very drug he had helped push into America's cities. Genovese did not go quietly, and he did not stop trying to run things. Even from behind bars, he attempted to hold on to power, issuing orders and keeping his grip on the family from inside prison walls. But there was no coming back from a 15-year sentence for a man his age. On the 14th of February 1969, Vito Genovese died in a federal medical prison, still officially the boss and still a prisoner. His story is the reminder that sits underneath this entire list. The drug trade did not spare anyone, not even the man at the very top of the food chain. Genovese ran an empire that supplied the streets the rest of these men fought over, and in the end, the same product that made the mafia rich was the thing that buried its top boss in a cell. The Italian families were the supply. The next man is the one who tried to cut them out of the picture entirely, and who became the most famous drug lord in the history of American film doing it. Number 3. Frank Lucas. He told the world that he smuggled heroin into America inside the coffins of dead American soldiers, that he cut the Italian mafia out of the business completely, and that he made so much money he could not count it fast enough. Some of that is true. A great deal of it is a story he told extremely well. But true or embellished, one thing is beyond dispute. The name Frank Lucas is now shorthand all over the world for the American gangster. Lucas came to Harlem from rural North Carolina, and he found his way to the side of the most important man in the neighborhood, a figure you will meet at the very top of this list. Lucas served as that man's driver, his protégé, and his shadow for years, watching and learning at the elbow of the godfather of Harlem himself. When his mentor died in 1968, Frank Lucas set out to build something bigger than anything his teacher had run. He had watched the godfather of Harlem operate with patience and restraint, and he took his own lesson from it, deciding that the real money was in owning the supply, not just the street. His idea was simple and audacious. Instead of buying his supply from the Italian families at their price, Lucas would go straight to the source. During the Vietnam War, he built a pipeline reaching all the way to Southeast Asia, to the poppy fields of the region, and arranged to bring high-purity heroin directly into the United States, skipping every middleman in between. By going straight to the source, Lucas was not just saving money. He was declaring open competition with the Italian families who had controlled the supply for generations, and men had died for far less. He branded his product Blue Magic and sold it purer and cheaper than the competition, and for a stretch in the early 1970s, he made a genuine fortune. For a while, Blue Magic was the most sought-after product in Harlem, and Lucas lived like a man who had solved a puzzle no one else could crack. He wore a floor-length fur coat to a heavyweight title fight and sat ringside among celebrities, a country boy turned Harlem royalty. And that single act of showing off would later be pointed to as the beginning of his undoing. Now, the legend. Lucas famously claimed that he smuggled his product into the country, hidden in the coffins of fallen American servicemen being flown home from the war. It is one of the most infamous stories in the history of the drug trade, and it is also one of the most disputed. Investigators who worked the case, and other traffickers who were there, have long insisted the truth was different, that the smuggling ran through furniture rather than coffins, and that Lucas was not the lone mastermind he made himself out to be, but one player in a larger operation. The enormous dollar figures, the purity claims, the body count, much of it has been challenged as the exaggeration of a man who understood the power of a good story. He gave interviews for the rest of his life, and the tales only grew in the telling, each version a little bigger and a little more cinematic than the last, until it became almost impossible to separate the dealer from the character he had built. So here is the honest version. Frank Lucas was a real and significant Harlem drug dealer who built a direct overseas supply line and made millions. He was also a brilliant self-mythologizer whose own account of his life should be taken with enormous caution. Both things are true, and the gap between them is exactly why his name looms so large. The downfall was ordinary compared to the legend. In the mid-1970s, investigators closed in, and a raid turned up a fortune in cash. The sum was staggering, millions of dollars stored where investigators could find it, the physical proof of an empire that had grown far past the point of hiding. Lucas was convicted on state and federal charges, and then he did what a striking number of men on this list did when the walls came down. He cooperated. Lucas provided information that helped bring cases against other figures in the drug world, and in exchange, his own punishment was reduced. He served time, got out, ran into trouble with the law again, and lived long enough to see his story turned into a blockbuster film that made him more famous than he ever was in his prime. That film, more than anything he ever did on the street, is the reason the name Frank Lucas travels around the world today. An actor gave his legend a face, and the legend swallowed the man whole. That is the strange final truth about Frank Lucas. His notoriety is only partly built on what he actually did. The rest is built on how well he told it, and on a movie that cemented the legend in the public mind forever. He destroyed his own operation the moment he became too big and too visible to ignore, and then he spent his later years selling the story of the empire back to the world. The man who claimed he cut out the mafia became a movie. The next man did not need a film. He put his own face on the cover of a national magazine and dared the government to touch him. 2 names left, and they are the biggest of all. If you want more history like this, subscribe before we get to number 1. It is free. Number 2. Leroy Barnes. He called himself Mr. Untouchable. He put on his best clothes, posed for the cover of a major national magazine, and practically dared the federal government to lay a hand on him. It was one of the most arrogant moves any criminal has ever made, and it worked, right up until it did not. Because the government took that dare personally. And when they finally convicted Leroy Barnes, the untouchable man did the one thing no one who knew him ever expected. He turned around and told them everything. Barnes came up the hard way, a heroin addict who kicked the habit during a prison stretch and came out determined to run the trade rather than be run by it. He partnered early with Italian mob figures, learned the business, and then built something new. He was disciplined in a way a lot of dealers were not, a man who studied the trade the way a business student studies a market, obsessed with logistics, pricing, and control. He did not want to be just another Harlem dealer. He wanted to organize the whole trade and sit at the head of it. Barnes organized the leading black drug dealers of Harlem into a body they called the Council, a board of about 7 men who ran the neighborhood's drug trade like a corporate enterprise. They set prices, divided territory, pooled resources, and settled disputes. And at the head of it sat Nicky Barnes. It was, in its way, a genuine innovation, applying the logic of a corporation to the chaos of the street drug trade, and it made the men on that council richer than almost any dealers Harlem had ever seen. The money was enormous, and Barnes flaunted it. He had the cars, the suits, the apartments, and a reputation for beating every case the state threw at him. Time after time he walked out of court a free man, and that record of slipping the law is what earned him his nickname. He was, or so it seemed, untouchable. Prosecutors would build cases against him, and again those cases fell apart, witnesses vanishing or changing their stories, evidence failing to stick. Every acquittal made him bolder, and every acquittal made the government angrier. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1977, a major national magazine put Barnes on its cover, dressed to the nines, under the headline, Mr. Untouchable, with an article laying out how this Harlem drug lord seemed to be beyond the reach of the law. The story is said to have infuriated the President of the United States, who reportedly ordered the Justice Department to make Barnes a top priority and bring him down. It is a rare thing for a magazine cover to become a piece of the case against the man who posed for it, but that is close to what happened. The image of Barnes smiling out at the country, untouchable, became a challenge the government could not let stand. Barnes had wanted the world to see him as untouchable. Instead, he had painted a target on his own back and handed it to the most powerful government on earth. It did not take long after that. Barnes was prosecuted under the federal continuing criminal enterprise law, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The untouchable man was going to die behind bars. And that should have been the end of it. But it was not, because of what happened next. From inside prison, Barnes came to believe his own people had betrayed him. He felt his associates had abandoned his family, kept his money, and disrespected him in ways he could not forgive. So he made a decision that stunned the underworld. Nicky Barnes became a cooperating witness for the government. He testified against his own counsel, against dozens of the people he had built his empire alongside, and his cooperation helped send a long list of former partners to prison. By the end, the man who had once organized Harlem's dealers into a single disciplined body had personally dismantled it from a witness stand, name by name. In exchange, his own sentence was eventually cut, and he was released and disappeared into witness protection, living out his final years under another name, far from the Harlem that had crowned him. The most famous drug lord in New York became a man with no name at all, erased on purpose, the price of the deal he had made to get out of a cell. Think about the full arc of it. Barnes reached the very top of the Harlem drug world, and then he could not resist being seen there, being celebrated for it, putting his own face on a magazine cover as if he were a movie star. That vanity is what brought the government down on him, and the betrayal he felt afterward is what turned the untouchable kingpin into the most damaging informant Harlem ever produced. He built the council, and in the end, he was the one who tore it apart. Barnes ran the council, Frank Lucas ran Blue Magic. But every single one of them, the flashy and the untouchable and the self-made alike, was standing on ground that one man had laid down first, decades before any of them sold their first bag. The godfather of Harlem himself. The man everyone on this list, whether they knew it or not, was trying to become. Number 1. Ellsworth Johnson. Before Frank Lucas, before Nicky Barnes, before the Supreme Team or Fat Cat or any of them, there was one man who decided that Harlem would be run by Harlem, and who was willing to go to war with the most dangerous gangsters in America to make it so. He won that war. He earned a seat at a table that no black man was supposed to sit at. He mentored the men who became legends, and he died as what he had always been, the undisputed godfather of the neighborhood that produced every other name on this list. Ellsworth Johnson was known to everyone as Bumpy, a nickname he had carried since childhood. He came to Harlem as a young man from the South and rose through its underworld during the 1930s, at a time when the neighborhood's most lucrative racket was the numbers game, an illegal lottery that ran on nickels and dimes and generated a staggering amount of money. The queen of that world was a woman named Stephanie St. Clair, and Bumpy Johnson became her enforcer and her right hand. St. Clair ran the numbers in Harlem, and Johnson was the muscle and the mind who protected her operation. A man known for being as intelligent and well-read as he was dangerous, quoting literature one moment and enforcing order the next. Their fight was for the soul of Harlem itself. A vicious white gangster from downtown, Dutch Schultz, decided he was going to take over Harlem's numbers rackets by force, muscling out the black operators who had built them. Bumpy Johnson led the resistance. The conflict was violent, and it made Johnson a hero to a community that saw him as a man standing up for Harlem against outsiders who wanted to bleed it dry. To a lot of people in the neighborhood, he was not a criminal at all. He was the man who refused to let downtown gangsters colonize Harlem, and that reputation would follow him for the rest of his life. When Schultz was finally killed, the balance of power shifted, and Bumpy was left standing. What he did next is why he sits at number 1. Rather than fight the Italian mafia forever, Johnson brokered an arrangement with them. Harlem's rackets would keep running, and Bumpy would be the man who managed the relationship between the neighborhood and the most powerful crime organization in the country. It made him something no one else had ever been, a black crime boss who dealt with the mafia as a respected partner rather than a subject. For decades, he was the most important figure in the Harlem underworld, feared by his enemies and beloved by many ordinary residents who saw him as a protector, a man who kept a certain order and looked out for his own. Stories spread of him paying rent for struggling families and handing out money on the block, part myth and part truth, the kind of legend that grows around a man who becomes a symbol. Bumpy was not a saint, and the record is clear about that. His life included narcotics and violence, and he served long stretches in some of the toughest prisons in America, including years in the federal system. He did time in Alcatraz, among the most feared prisons the country ever ran, and came out of each stretch with his standing in Harlem intact. The crown weighed on him the same way it weighed on everyone else on this list. He simply carried it longer, and with more dignity in the eyes of his community than any of them. He walked out of prison each time still respected, still the man other men answered to, his authority somehow untouched by the years he had lost. And here is the thread that ties this entire countdown together in one man. One of the young men who worked at Bumpy Johnson's side, who drove him and guarded him and studied everything he did, was Frank Lucas. The most famous name in this whole story learned the game standing next to the man at number 1. Everything Lucas later claimed as his own genius, he first saw modelled by the quiet, careful boss he worked for. When people talk about the godfather of Harlem, the mentor, the blueprint, the origin of it all, they are talking about Bumpy Johnson. His end was quieter than his life. In the summer of 1968, Bumpy Johnson suffered a fatal heart attack in a Harlem restaurant and died at the table, an old man who had outlasted his enemies and kept his throne to the very last. The godfather of Harlem went out not in a shootout or a raid, but quietly, at dinner, in the neighborhood he had ruled for a generation. He is the one figure on this list who died still holding his crown, but even he had paid for it, in the long years he spent behind bars, in the violence that shadowed his whole life. The godfather of Harlem got the ending closest to peace of anyone here, and it still cost him decades of his freedom to get there. Because that is the one rule none of them could ever beat. Every man on this list reached for the same throne, the seat Bumpy Johnson built, and every one of them paid the same terrible price for sitting in it. The crown does not come off clean. It comes off in a cell, in a coffin, or in a disappearance. 10 of the most notorious names New York ever produced, 10 empires, and one rule underneath all of them. The city hands you the crown, and then it takes everything you have to pay for it. Subscribe before you go. It is free, it keeps these coming, and we will see you on the next list.